Hallo ihr Lieben, wir machen eine kleine Wiederholung von den Vergangenheitsformen im Deutsch. We're going to do a quick review of the past tense in German. Now, if you remember, we have different forms of the past tense. And specifically, we have three distinct forms. So, three forms. The first one, typically called Preteritum. It's also called simple past. It's called preterite. It's called imperfect. It has a variety of names. That was the first one. The second one was perfect. It's also called the conversational or narrative past. Or it is called present perfect. And then the third one was called plusquamperfekt. And that one is also referred to as past perfect. Only got one extra name for that one. So before I even talk about how we formed these, I want to tell you about when they are. So as a reminder, if you have a timeline, all right, this is a timeline. This is the present. So in present, we use present tense. Then we have simple past and present perfect, right? They're one step back. And then if you wanted to use plusquamperfekt, that is another step back. So that's our timeline. And I'll explain that more when I get to the actual past perfect to tell you more about what that means. But the important part is that these two are at the same time. Meaning that when you're using them, you can combine those two into the same sentences, you can combine them into the same contexts, you can switch back and forth, and it works. However, we of course have specific contexts in which we use them. So, I'm going to tell you about those contexts. So, preterite, the first one, Preteritum, was typically used in formal writing, in stories and books, in newspapers and magazines, and in storytelling. So, for example, that would be something like a fairy tale. You would also use it when you're doing formal speaking, so formal spoken contexts. So, for example, if something is reported on a news show, or if somebody is in court reporting on the past event, you would use this form. And this form, of course, was a single verb, changed conjugation. I'm going to flip the page in a second and give you an example. So an example of that would be a regular verb, would show up like machen becomes ich machte, right? So just like in English where we add the ed, the German adds this te. And of course we had different groups of verbs. So we had other verbs that do not take those endings. So an example of an irregular verb would be gehen, and that would form to ich ging. So it has a stem change, complete different stem, and no ending. We also have other groups. We have some mixed verbs that take the te and have a stem change. I'll give you one example. Mixed verb. So for the mixed verb, I'll use bringen, to bring, and that becomes ich brachte. So you have the ending and you have the stem change. Okay, for the second form, so that second form was present perfect, or in German perfekt. In what context do we use that in? So it is also called the narrative past or the conversational past because it is typically used in spoken language, casual conversation. So when Germans are speaking to each other, they typically use this tense. It is also used in informal writing. So that could be something like a letter or a blog, things of that nature. You're going to come across this tense. Okay, perfect, of course, was formed with a helping verb and a past participle. So helping verbs here were haben and sein. And the past participles were those GE, stem, T or EN things. And of course we had a bunch of varieties of these. You had a lot of verb quizzes last year with those on there. So let me just use one example for a regular verb. I'm going to go with machen again. So in a whole sentence it would be something like ich habe Hausaufgaben. Skipped a bunch of that word. Gemacht. So past participle is at the end of the sentence. GE stem T. We're using haben in second place. The important part here is this haben is in present tense. So the helping verb in present perfect, the very first form of perfect, is in present tense, present perfect, present tense. And you have the past participle, which indicates that you're in the past. So the actual sentence is past, the helping verb is in present. You also had to differentiate between haben and sein. Sein, of course, was used when it's a change of state or location. And we had some irregulars. If you don't remember those, I have a Quizlet stack for you guys that you can use to practice. Lastly, the last one was our Plusquamperfekt. So Plusquamperfekt. And Plusquamperfekt is special because it indicates a different time. So it is used to talk about an action that happened before another event in the past. So that means it is an extra step back. So in English, I could say, for example, my student had practiced his vocabulary before we had tutoring yesterday. Or before we had tutoring, my student had practiced his vocabulary, right? So you know that we had tutoring in the past. This is now, I'm talking about this moment. And before that, another event happened, and that is he practiced or he studied his vocab. That is our Plusquamperfekt, talking about that event. So how do we do it? We do it the same way as we do perfect, except that the helping verb, which is still haben and sein, is in past tense. Specifically in this case in preteritum, so in simple past. So I had the sentence in perfect, right? So this is just this moment. Ich habe Hausaufgaben gemacht. Just abbreviating that. So here's habe gemacht. That is tense number 2. That is present perfect, right? Perfect. Now, going one step back, that becomes ich hatte Hausaufgaben gemacht. So here's hatte in simple past, showing me that it's an extra step back. Okay. Whenever you're thinking of plusquamperfect and perfect, I want you to really focus. Everything else in the tense works exactly the same way. All the past participles look exactly the same as they do in perfect. They're the same past participle. Choosing the actual helping verb is exactly the same. You're going to choose haben unless you have a change of state, change of condition, or an irregular verb. That's when you have sein. And then all you're going to do is you're going to conjugate this helping verb in your simple past conjugation. Okay. So lastly, there's a little table that sort of summarizes all the different ways of conjugating these. And I want you to write this down, so feel free to pause the video. On the side, you see the different verb types. So you have weak verbs. Those are also the regular verbs. It separates out modal verbs because they work a little bit different. Mixed verbs, those are the ones that have those stem changes in the TE ending. And then the strong verbs, which are your irregular verbs, which have that EN ending and a stem change in present tense, and sometimes, or typically I would argue, also a stem change in the perfect forms, in those past participles. So it's going through the conjugation of all these. Now, of course, we have some other verbs that are not sampled here, right? We have inseparable prefix verbs, we have ihren verbs, that all look a little bit different when you're doing the past participles. But for now, these are the basics of how all these different tense forms work together. So write these down.